Lord, you say to us, "Take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her. Hear, for I will speak noble things, and from my lips will come what is right. They are all straight to the one who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. May we hear and understand in accordance with your will." Amen. Our reading today comes from the first book of Kings. This is sort of following in the trajectory of quite a while back. We talked about the end of Saul's kingship and the beginning of David's, and we talked a bit about David, and now we're into the reign of his son Solomon. And so this is I know it's a bit of a long reading, but I can't, we got to get the whole story in there, you know. The actual reading is like 2 verses, and then skip 2, and then 1 verse, and then skip 5, and then do these 3 verses, and no. I don't know why they do that to us. So, sit back, relax, and listen to the dedication of the temple and Solomon's prayer. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the ancestral houses of the Israelites, before King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. All the people of Israel assembled to King Solomon at the festival in the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month. And all the elders of Israel came, and the priests carried the ark. So they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of the meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. Then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim made a covering above the ark and its poles. The poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. They are there to this day. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses had placed there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites when they came out of the land of Egypt. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever." Then the king turned around and blessed all of the assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel stood. He said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hand has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to my father David, saying, 'Since the day that I brought my people out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city from any of the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people, Israel. My father David had it in mind to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, 'You did well to consider building a house for my name. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son who shall be born to you shall build the house for my name.' Now the Lord had upheld the promise that he made. For I have risen in the place of my father David. I sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. There I have provided a place for the ark, in which the covenant of the Lord that I made with our ancestors when he brought them out of the land of Egypt." Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands to heaven. He said, "O Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and steadfast love for your servants, who walk before you with all their heart. the covenant that you kept for your servant, my father David, as you declared to him. You promised with your mouth and have this day fulfilled with your hand. Therefore, O Lord, God of Israel, keep for your servant, my father David, that which you promised to him, saying, there shall never fail you a successor before me to sit on the throne of Israel. If only your children look to their way, to walk before me as you have walked before me. Therefore, O God of Israel, let your word be confirmed, which you have promised to your servant, my father David. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Even heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, much less this house that I have built. Regard your servant's prayer and his plea, O Lord, my God, heeding the cry and the prayer that your servant prays to you today, that your eyes may be open and the night and day toward this house, the place of which you said, my name shall be there, that you may heed the prayer that your servant prays towards this place. Hear the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. O hear in heaven your dwelling place, heed and forgive. If someone sins against a neighbor and is given an oath to swear, and comes and swears before your altar in this house, then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants, condemning the guilty by bringing their conduct on their own head, and vindicating the righteous by rewarding them according to their righteousness. When your people Israel, having sinned against you, are defeated before an enemy, but turn again to you, confess your name, pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven, forgive the sin of your people Israel, and bring them again to the land that you gave to their ancestors. He keeps on like that for a really long time, but we're gonna end it there. It gets a little repetitive on some of the exhortations as well. So, this is the commemoration of the first temple in Jerusalem, the primary temple, the temple that gets later destroyed by the Babylonians before taken in captivity, and then rebuilt, and then destroyed again by the Romans. And as of now, there is a chunk of one wall left over in the city of Jerusalem, the Weeping Wall, for any who are familiar. That's this. This is the commemoration of that temple, bringing in the Ark of the Covenant and opening its doors. Now, it's interesting to me that Solomon, in giving this dedication, leaves out a little bit in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is sort of the same stories as 1st and 2nd Kings, but told slightly differently. There actually is a reason that Solomon gets to build the temple instead of his father David. And it's interesting to me that that logic doesn't get applied here. They don't really give a reason that David wasn't able to build the temple. But at least according to David was forbidden by God to build the temple himself because he was a man of war. And the temple could not be built by a man of war. It had to be built by a man of peace. Solomon, the root of Solomon's name being Shalom, the Hebrew word for peace, making him literally by name the man of peace. And that's an interesting logic to it. I think there's two main reasons that it ends up waiting for this man of peace. Largely to show, in the first place, the devotion of the people. In a lot of surrounding empires and nations, in Egypt, in Assyria, in Babylon, temples were largely furnished using riches stolen from surrounding people that they had conquered. Quite explicitly, when the pharaoh Tutankhamun took control of Egypt, he ordered that plunder be taken from all of the surrounding nations and melted down to make new ritual items for the temples. It was a show of their power. It was a show of the dominance of their gods, that their things were made not from stuff they had supplied themselves, but things that they were able to take from those around them. And so just as the Egyptians could take what they wished from those around them, the gods themselves could take what they wished from the earth. Here, they're not allowed to do that, right? It has to be a man of peace, not someone who's coming and taking all these things in, but it has to be furnished out of the devotion of the people of Israel themselves. It's also probably relevant that a lot of these texts in 1st and 2nd Kings are highlighting the difference between Israel and the surrounding nations, especially when this is very obviously put together and compiled in the format we have while they are in exile in Babylon. Their whole goal is to point out we're not like that. We aren't the ones that are taking everything. We care about the world, or we are caretakers of this world. And sure, they went to war and they did their things when necessary, but it was just a radically different vision of the divine and of the people of God. It's also, I think, very clear how post-exilic, or how exilic this text is, when repeatedly throughout Solomon's prayer, I ended at the first one, but repeatedly he talks about, if they are conquered by their enemies, may they eventually be allowed to return. Because that's literally what happened. And some scholars like to point to this as sort of a reference to Egypt, except according to the stories, they weren't conquered by Egypt. They went down voluntarily to Egypt. That wasn't a conquest and exile. That was a voluntary travel. The time that they are conquered and put into exile in the north is Assyria, from which they don't really return, or later from Babylon, from which they do. And this repeated call to God to make sure that if they are conquered, that they can return again to this temple, this central location, this meeting point, makes it very, very clear the situation in which people are looking at this text. So it is, in fact, shaped by the exile. It is also an interesting commentary, I think, on them. The way it is written is a commentary sort of on their own history, but largely in what they exclude that we know of. So, for instance, the temple design here, if you go through and read the incredibly detailed description of the design of the temple, right? It is not that radically different from other temples around them in Canaan, in Mesopotamia, in this whole area, including other temples we have found in Israel and Judah. We'll come back to that one later. The difference is normally in the Holy of Holies, that central back place where it says there's a cloud, what you would have is either a statue or a carved stone with the divine image on it, a carving of some kind, or often in Egypt and Mesopotamia they were made with wood and then covered with gold. But you would have the officially recognized image of the god. And only the high priests were ever allowed in there to see it. If it ends up traveling around, they would sometimes put it on a platform with these long poles, right? Just like the poles they carry the Ark of the Covenant with. And it would be sort of draped over, so you could sort of see it, but not quite. And instead of that, they have the Ark of the Covenant, in which is not a divine image, but instead is the Ten Commandments and the covenant that God makes with them inside the text. Now, why would they put the text in there instead of 10th or 11th century BC, the image of the God? Because it's worth pointing out, I think, that the prohibition in the Ten Commandments about not making graven images excludes people from making them for themselves or for anywhere else. It very strictly would not prevent them from having one in the temple made by the official high priest, very technically. Very technically. Regardless, they don't have one in there. They have the text. Because all the temples at this time, including Israel temples, that we uncover, that we dig up, have a place for a stele, for a carving or a divine image in them, not a box.
So clearly in all their Israelite temples, they had divine images. But it's not put here because, once again, this is being compiled while they're in exile. And in Babylon, they don't have any of the temple stuff. The temple was destroyed. The only thing they got to keep, because for the Babylonians it was considered a sort of a sign of their authority to have control of these things, were the texts. The priests brought into exile still had the writings that they had. This is the origin of the synagogue tradition as well, where people would come and hear the texts, because largely you don't have like weekly festivals so much. The Sabbath is a thing that everybody kind of did on their own for the most part. But they had the texts. And so instead of these images that are lost, destroyed, whatever, they centralize the text. And when they get back and rebuild their temple, what goes in the core of it? Those texts. Because that is what has bound them to God through this whole time. The text becomes central forevermore. Now, for an example of what I'm talking about, there is an unearthed temple at Arad, which is in kind of on the edge of the desert, right, in Judah. There is another temple. The text doesn't talk about them commissioning other temples, but we have uncovered very obvious temples with like writings on the wall indicating that this is a temple to the Tetragrammaton, the YHWH, the God of Israel and Judah. And in that temple at Arad, which comes into usage somewhere around the 11th century, which is about this time, give or take, there is the Holy of Holies in this temple. It's a little smaller than the one in Jerusalem, but there is this place, and you have stands for 2 divine images. And in front of them are 2 altars. This temple at Arad was buried. It ceased being used in the 7th century, right about the time that Assyria was careening through, wiping out all the random towns. King Hezekiah, by the way, was besieged in Jerusalem. So they had basically lost all of their outlying fortifications and everything. And that is about the same time that these temples ceased to be used. So at this time, the other temples that they have these images in them to more than one God, even though it's dedicated to the God that gets held onto and remembered. There are, in fact, others. I always love the psalm that I put to use for our call to worship this morning, 82, because people always get this weird look when they read something where God is talking to other gods. Because we're just not used to hearing that, right? But in the Old Testament, the Old Testament acknowledges the existence of other gods repeatedly. The whole point of the commandment to not have any other god before me is because there's a lot of other gods out there. But they belong to one. And over time, they sort of morph that idea into, no, there really is just one and the rest of them aren't really gods. But for the ancient Israelites, those were other gods that their God had to contend with. Speaking of 2 deities, there are actually numerous biblical allusions to this in the Old Testament. A handful of them still show up. If you look at the reign of King Josiah, which is a little later in 2 Kings or 2 Chronicles, it talks about him having to go through and remove all the sacred images to Asherah, the other primary deity that people had been worshiping throughout the land to that time. So in other places, if you read close, it kind of gets hidden in translation because the other deity's name, Asherah, also specifically refers to trees. And so when the Bible talks about a sacred pole or a sacred grove or stuff about sacred trees, it's often a reference to Asherah's name, but it gets rendered as the trees instead of as a divine name. It was in there. And I mean, that's not super surprising because they talk all the time about various rulers who don't walk in the way of the Lord and worship other deities and put up high places. So it's not necessarily shocking that we would find evidence of the worship of other deities in the territories. But somehow, nonetheless, it just feels really uncomfortable for us because we're just not used to hearing about it anymore. There's art. There is existing artwork that shows a divine image of Yahweh, of the God of Israel, alongside Asherah. I was really tempted to put it on the front of the bulletin, but I figured that might be a bit much. I printed it out, though. So if afterwards you would like to see the 10th or 11th century BC image off of a pot, off of a large urn that has been recovered, that literally in the text says Yahweh and his Asherah, because she is his divine consort. It exists. So there were other deities at various times worshipped in ancient Israel, which later on became problematic. And especially at the reign of Josiah, which is in between. Josiah rules a little after Assyria destroys the north, and a little before Babylon conquers the south and destroys everything. Josiah goes through enormous religious reforms in the land. If you read the story, it says that he had the priests go into the temple. He wanted an accounting of the contents of the temple. This temple, the same temple. And when they go in, they find a text that talks about, it says they find a treatise on law, the law of God, or a bunch of commandments from God. And they bring that and they get a copy of it made and they bring it to Josiah, and Josiah's like, oh, hey, we're in trouble. We need to fix things right now. And it says he has the divine images removed. So up to the point of Josiah, at least, in the temples around Israel and Judah, there are sacred images of other deities being worshipped. That ends at Josiah. Josiah centralizes all worship to Jerusalem, to the one temple. And it is somewhere in this time period that the temple at Arad ceases to function. That these other places all disappear. A lot of them were wiped out by the Assyrians a little while back. People had kind of started rebuilding and reusing them. They shut them all down and centralized it again to Jerusalem. At least according to the text, under the orders of Josiah, to centralize everything back in Jerusalem. Whatever it was he found, we don't know. It doesn't name the text. There's all kinds of biblical scholarship guessing what it might have been that they found, that they had been ignoring for who knows how long. But they found it and changed it. So now, when we go back to this text, what gets authorized? One temple. Solomon does not build a temple in Jerusalem and a temple in Arad and a temple in Samaria and a temple right? He doesn't build all these. He issues one. And in that one temple is the Ark of the Covenant, which there is only one of. The text that they put together and preserve through exile acknowledges only that one place and space, for them to centralize their identity, to come together as a united people with a united history and united tradition. And in the process, they are providing a script for those exiles when they return. There's no need for this. No one else wrote a lengthy description of the commissioning of their temples, right? It's not a thing. In Egypt, there's references, like there's a picture that says, yes, we commissioned the temple, it was commissioned by this person what a good ruler he was, right? But they don't give all this because it doesn't matter. But it does here because they're about to go back and rebuild. The point of this text is not to accurately record their own history. There was no concept of objective history in the ancient world. It doesn't exist. We can't ask that of the text because it didn't exist, they didn't care. That's an us thing, okay? This was the leaders in exile looking back at what documents they had of their history and their traditions and anything that they had and piecing it together so that they could have a guide to their next steps, returning from exile back into the land of their people, rebuilding their temple, reestablishing themselves as a people and a society. There is a need for that guidance. And that is, to be fair, the same thing we come to this book for today, right? That need for guidance. We have more texts than they did because they made a bunch. And then later on, followers of Jesus wrote a bunch more for us to use that have their own content and commentary on the rest and a different way, a perspective on interpreting and working with the rest of the text. But that is what we do. We go to this to look for an example of the past that we can find and figure out how that becomes relevant for us now and going forward. And that's truth. Truth is messy like that, right? Objective history is not always that helpful to us because it just creates questions. But narrative history helps us find the truth in it. The truth is, they were a people in exile who were on the brink of obliteration. They were getting ready to hopefully return home. And if they were going to survive as a people, they needed a consistent, coherent story that tethered them to their own past, united them together, and gave them a vision of the future. That's what this is. That's what it does. So, it is a tool for meaning, bathed in God's light. But it is a tool for our meaning, bathed in God's light. When we try to turn it into something else, when we insist that it is something that we want it to be rather than accepting what it is, we endanger this. We lose out on the opportunities to learn from this, to grow, to figure out new ways to find that meaning and continue carrying it forward. That's what they did. We can't denigrate their process and experience and those needs because it sometimes makes us uncomfortable. We can learn and grow and move forward. So don't worry about whether or not this is an accurate record of history, because it's not. Don't worry if it's a law book, because you know what? It's several of them mushed together, and a lot of it was never enforced because it was written at times when they weren't in control, right? That's not what it's about. It's about a vision of meaning and purpose and unity that pushes us forward with value in the light of God, in the light of truth. We cannot be scared of truth if we are going to have a faith with hope for a future, for a present. We cannot demand this to be something other than it was, just like we cannot demand God to be something other than God is. And understanding those things, working through those things that make us uncomfortable, like God yelling at other gods and pictures of Yahweh with his wife found in other temples, that can't dissuade us. That can't falter us. That is an opportunity to invite us into better reflection, into more meaningful contemplation of what we have been given and what we can do with it. We gather today in a very different temple. This is not what was commissioned by Solomon, right, in Jerusalem. And yet, we think God resides with us here. So do not be discouraged to look at this and think that maybe there's more to the story, because we know there's more to the story already. And there's more to the story yet to come. Amen.